The ink was barely dry on the divorce papers. Richard Sterling, a man worth $300 million, sat back in his leather chair and checked his watch. He wasn't just winning, he was annihilating his wife Isabella. He had the best lawyers money could buy, a prenuptial agreement that was tighter than a bank vault, and hidden assets in the Cayman Islands that no one knew about. He thought Isabella was leaving with nothing but the clothes on her back. He thought the game was over. But then the courtroom doors groaned open. An old man in a dusty grey suit walked in carrying a single battered briefcase. Richard didn't know it yet, but his life was about to end not with a bang, but with a piece of paper that would expose a 20-year lie. Stay tuned, because you are about to witness the most satisfying courtroom takedown in history. The air in courtroom 4B was stale, smelling of floor wax and expensive cologne. To Richard Sterling, it smelled like victory. Richard adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, glancing sideways at the woman he had been married to for 12 years. Isabella sat alone at the plaintiff's table. She looked small, almost fragile, in a simple navy dress that had seen better days. Her hands were folded in her lap, her head bowed. She hadn't looked at him once since the proceedings began 3 hours ago. Good Richard thought a cruel smirk playing on his lips. She knows her place. Finally. Richard was a man who measured the world in assets and liabilities. For the last decade, he had built Sterling Heights, a real estate empire that reshaped the skyline of Seattle. He was aggressive charming when he needed to be, and utterly ruthless when it came to protecting his bottom line. Isabella. She had been an asset once, a pretty face to have on his arm at charity galas. A quiet presence who managed the house and never asked questions about late nights or sudden business trips to the French Riviera. But lately, she had become a liability. She had started asking questions. She had started looking at bank statements. So Richard had done what he always did with liabilities. He liquidated them. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Lawrence said, his voice booming from the bench. "Does the defense have any final remarks before I issue my ruling on the division of assets?" Richard's lawyer, Garrison Blackwood, stood up. Blackwood was a man who charged $2,000 an hour and was worth every penny. He smoothed his silk tie and gave the judge a confident nod. "Your Honor." Blackwood began, his voice smooth as velvet. "The facts here are indisputable. Mr. Sterling's wealth, the entirety of the Sterling Heights Corporation, was built solely through his own tireless efforts. The prenuptial agreement signed by Mrs. Sterling 12 years ago clearly states that any assets acquired during the marriage remain the sole property of the primary earner. Mrs. Sterling has not contributed financially to this union. In fact, as we have demonstrated, her spending habits have been a drain on the marital estate." Richard stifled a chuckle. That was a nice touch. Isabella's spending habits amounted to groceries and keeping the heat on in their drafty mansion while Richard bought sports cars. But the narrative was what mattered, not the truth. Furthermore, Blackwood continued pacing in front of the judge. "Mrs. Sterling has no claim to the deeper assets. She signed away her rights. We are generously offering a settlement of $50,000 to help her transition into a more modest lifestyle. We believe this is more than fair, considering she brought nothing into this marriage." The judge nodded, looking bored. He shuffled the papers on his desk. It was a slam dunk. The prenup was ironclad. Richard had made sure of it. He had practically forced Isabella to sign it the morning of their wedding, telling her it was just a formality for his investors. She had trusted him then. Stupid girl, Richard thought. He looked at her again. She was trembling. Was she crying? He hoped so. He wanted her to feel the weight of her mistake. She had tried to leave him. No one walked away from Richard. Sterling, unless he threw them out. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Lawrence said, looking over his spectacles at Isabella. "You dismissed your previous counsel yesterday. You are currently representing yourself. Do you have anything to say in response to Mr. Blackwood's summary?" The courtroom went silent. The stenographer's fingers hovered over the keys. Isabella slowly raised her head. Her eyes were dry. They weren't red from crying. They were clear, icy blue and focused on something at the back of the room. "I do not have a statement, Your Honor," Isabella said softly. Her voice didn't waver. "But my counsel does." Richard frowned. Counsel? She had fired that incompetent strip mall lawyer legal aid yesterday. She couldn't afford anyone else. He had frozen her credit cards. "Counsel," Judge Lawrence asked, confused. "I thought you were representing yourself." "He was delayed," Isabella said. "Traffic. This is highly irregular," Blackwood snapped, sensing a disturbance in his perfectly choreographed play. "If counsel was not present at the start of the hearing..." Clack, clack, clack. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound of a cane hitting the floor echoed through the room. A man stepped inside. He was old, ancient even. He wore a grey three-piece suit that looked like it had been tailored in the 1950s and hadn't been pressed since. He carried a battered leather briefcase that looked like it had survived a war. His hair was a shock of white wool and unkempt, and he wore thick tortoise-shell glasses. Richard let out a short, derisive laugh. Who was this? A grandfather wandering in from the nursing home? But Garrison Blackwood wasn't laughing. Richard saw his lawyer's posture stiffen. The shark, usually so composed, looked like he had just seen a ghost. The old man walked slowly down the center aisle. He didn't look at Richard. He didn't look at the judge. He walked straight to Isabella, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and then turned to the bench. "Arthur P. Whitmore," the old man rasped. His voice was like gravel grinding together. "Representing Mrs. Isabella Sterling, and I apologize for the tardiness, Your Honor. Finding a parking spot for a '67 Lincoln is harder than it used to be." Judge Lawrence's eyes went wide. "Arthur Whitmore." "The Arthur Whitmore, I thought you retired 10 years ago." "I did," Arthur said, placing his briefcase on the table with a heavy thud. He undid the latches with a loud snap. "But for this, I decided to come back." Richard leaned over to Blackwood, whispering aggressively, "Who is this fossil? Get him out of here!" Blackwood turned to Richard, and for the first time Richard saw fear in the lawyer's eyes. "That fossil is the man who took down the tobacco industry in the 90s, Richard. He's the one who bankrupted the Monolith oil conglomerate in '04. He doesn't take divorce cases." "Well, he's taking this one," Richard hissed. "Crush him. Use the prenup." Arthur Whitmore pulled a single thin file folder out of his briefcase. He didn't have stacks of boxes like Blackwood. Just one folder. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Lawrence said, regaining his composure. "It seems Mrs. Sterling has retained new counsel, given Mr. Whitmore's reputation. I will allow it." "Objection," Blackwood said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "This is an ambush. We haven't had time to review new counsel." "Overruled," the judge said, leaning forward with interest. "Proceed, Mr. Whitmore." Mr. Blackwood claims the prenuptial agreement bars Mrs. Sterling from any assets. What say you?" Arthur smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf looking at a trapped rabbit. "The prenuptial agreement," Arthur said, holding up the document Richard knew so well. "A fascinating piece of fiction. It states that Isabella has no claim to Richard's assets because she brought no material wealth to the marriage." Arthur tossed the prenup onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of Richard. "That," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "was the first lie." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Richard stared at the prenup on the table. He felt a prickle of sweat on the back of his neck. Lie. What was the old man talking about? Isabella was a waitress when he met her. She lived in a studio apartment above a bakery. She had student loans. She was a nobody. That was why he picked her. She was malleable. Grateful. Arthur Whitmore began to pace. For an old man with a cane, he moved with surprising energy, like a predator circling its prey. "Let us talk about history, Your Honor," Arthur said. "Mr. Blackwood here has painted a picture of a self-made man, Richard Sterling, the architect of the Seattle skyline, a man who pulled himself up by his bootstraps." Arthur chuckled dryly. "It makes for a good magazine cover. But courtrooms deal in facts, not fairy tales." "Objection." Blackwood stood up, his face reddening. "Relevance. My client's background is not on trial." "It goes to the heart of the assets, Your Honor," Arthur countered instantly. "If the foundation of the house is rotten, the roof collapses. I intend to prove the foundation is rotten." "I'll allow it, but get to the point, Mr. Whitmore," Judge Lawrence said. Arthur nodded. He turned to Richard. "Mr. Sterling, you established Sterling Heights in 2011. Is that correct?" Richard straightened his tie. He could handle this. He was the CEO. He did interviews on CNN. "That is correct." "And the initial capital, the seed money. Where did it come from?" Richard recited the rehearsed line. "Personal savings and a small loan from a private investor." "A private investor," Arthur repeated. "And the name of this investor?" "It was a private equity firm," Richard said smoothly. "Vanguard Holdings. It's all in the discovery documents." "Ah, yes. Vanguard Holdings." Arthur walked back to his table and opened his thin folder. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. "A shell company registered in Delaware. Very standard. But Mr. Sterling, who funded Vanguard Holdings..." Richard frowned. He didn't actually know. That was the point of the shell. He had been desperate for cash back then, on the verge of bankruptcy from a failed tech startup. Then miraculously, the money had appeared. His broker had told him it was an anonymous angel investor who believed in his vision. He never questioned it. He took the money and built his emerald. "I don't know the individual partners," Richard said dismissively. "It's a blind trust." Arthur turned to the gallery, then back to the judge. "A blind trust. Mr. Sterling claims he is a genius businessman, yet he took $5 million from a stranger without knowing who signed the check." Arthur walked over to Isabella. She was still looking straight ahead, her face like a marble statue. 12 years ago," Arthur said, his voice softening. "Isabella was indeed working as a waitress, but that is not who she is. You see, Richard, you didn't marry a waitress. You married Isabella Harrington." Richard blinked. "Her maiden name is Miller." "Her mother's maiden name was Miller," Arthur corrected. "Her father was Archibald Harrington." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even the stenographer stopped typing for a second. Richard froze. Harrington. As in the Harrington Steel dynasty, the family that basically built the railroads in the West. But that was impossible. The Harringtons were old money royalty. Isabella drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic. She clipped coupons. Archibald Harrington was estranged from his family. Arthur explained to the room, though his eyes were locked on Richard. He wanted a simple life. He died when Isabella was young, leaving everything in a trust that activates only upon marriage to ensure his daughter was provided for. Arthur held up the paper. This is the bank record for Vanguard Holdings. The angel investor who gave you the $5 million to start your company, Richard, was your wife. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. The room seemed to tilt. That's a lie, Richard stammered, standing up. She didn't have money. She asked me for an allowance for groceries. Because she is humble. Arthur roared, his voice suddenly filling the room like thunder. And because she loved you. She instructed the trust to invest in you anonymously, because she didn't want you to feel overshadowed. She wanted you to feel like a man. She wanted to build a life with you, not by you. Arthur slammed the paper down on the defense table. You didn't build Sterling Heights, Richard. She did. Every brick, every window, every beam of steel was paid for by the woman you are trying to throw out on the street with $50,000. Blackwood was frantically reading the paper. His hands were shaking. He looked up at Richard, his face pale. Richard, is this true? Did you ever vet the source of the funding? I didn't know, Richard whispered. Ignorance is not a defense, Arthur shouted. Now let's look at that prenup again. Clause 4. Section B. If it is determined that one party provided the initial capital for the primary business assets, the prenuptial agreement is void and assets are subject to a 50-50 split. Arthur leaned in close to Richard. You put that clause in there, Richard. Remember, you were so paranoid that she might try to claim credit for your work that you wanted to protect your original investment. You thought you were protecting your savings. Instead, you just handed her the keys to the kingdom. Richard slumped back into his chair. 50-50. He was going to lose half of everything. $150 million. Gone. He looked at Isabella. She finally turned her head. She looked him right in the eye. She didn't look sad anymore. She looked powerful. Well, Judge Lawrence said, a strange smile on his face. This changes the landscape considerably. Mr. Blackwood, do you need a recess? Yes, Your Honor. Blackwood practically screamed. No, Your Honor, Arthur interrupted calmly. We don't need a recess, because we aren't asking for 50%. Arthur walked back to his table and pulled out a second document. This one was thicker, bound in red tape. You see, Judge, if Richard had just been an arrogant fool, we would settle for half. But Richard hasn't just been building buildings. He's been hiding things, dark things. And since the prenup is now void, everything is discoverable. Arthur dropped the red folder in front of the judge. We aren't here for half, Richard, Arthur said, turning back to the terrified husband. We're here for it all. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. It pressed down on Richard Sterling's chest like a slab of concrete. Judge Lawrence stared at the red folder Arthur Whitmore had dropped on his bench. The judge didn't open it immediately. He looked at Richard, then at Garrison Blackwood. The look was one of profound disappointment, the kind a father gives a son who has not just broken a rule, but broken the family's honor. Mr. Blackwood,